Thank you guys for coming out tonight. This has been a really fun. By the way, that drilling that you're hearing in the background, that's the soundtrack to my visit to London. Everywhere I go, there's drilling, so don't invite me over, at least not on this trip. Last week it was the Ace Hotel. They were doing this essentially above my room, and today it's in here, which is terrific. So my name's Jeff Gothelf. I work for a company called Neo, based out of San Francisco, New York. We're a product company, a services company. One of the things that we do is a little bit of education and conferences and workshops and training, which is what Lean Day London was all about. Really great event. And as Craig said, when the videos come out, definitely check them out. An amazing array of talks about leaders, practitioners in large companies attempting to become more agile and more evidence-based in their processes. So really, warts and all, right? Some good stuff, some challenging stuff. It was a really great conversation. We had Spotify and Hearst and the BBC and lots of other really interesting companies. So tonight, what I want to talk about is kind of the building blocks for building a culture of innovation. People throw around the word innovation a lot. I don't even think it means anything that much anymore. I don't think people really know what it means to say, oh, it's almost, in some companies that I come into, it's almost like something you sprinkle onto a project at the end or at the beginning, and it doesn't really change anything. But I want to talk about what makes up the culture of innovation. How do you build an organization that supports innovative teams that are agile with a lowercase a. One of the things that I talk about a lot is not subscribing necessarily to the church of agile, right, the capital A, but really more about being agile and really approaching work from a philosophical shift in mindset as opposed to just a process shift. And so we'll talk about what makes up an innovative team, and I'll share with you a couple of anecdotes and stories from my youth, which will be mildly embarrassing. So let's get started. I'm starting to share a story with you, actually. So in 1995, I graduated from undergraduate university, 95. And my first job, I graduated on a Saturday, and on Monday, I joined the Circus. That's the Circus I joined right there. I took these photos. These are old prints that I scanned in. I joined the Clyde, Beatty Brothers Circus. And I at the time, this was almost 20 years ago, yikes. This was the largest three-ring tented circus in the United States. So the difference between this and Ringling Brothers is that Ringling Brothers performs in arenas, and we performed in a tent. So we were kind of traditional, old school, classic circus. Lots of interest, and I spent 6 months on the road from May until whatever 6 months later is, 11 November, roughly. I'm not doing the math in my head. Roughly November, and we spent 6 months on the road touring with the circus, and it was a fascinating time. And I met a lot of really interesting people over that period of time, not the least of which was Mr. Steven Tyler was there from the legendary band Aerosmith. Now that's me next to him, by the way. He hasn't changed much in that time, and I've suffered severe hair loss in the time. Time can be very, very cruel. But Steven Tyler would come to the circus, and it was really cool. And it was an interesting time. One of the more interesting people that I met over the course of time, and more interesting really even than Steven Tyler, was the human Cannonball. And if you can't see him, I know it's hard to see from over there. That's him right there, right? At the top being loaded into the cannon up there. And so just to give you a sense of what this was, it's a cannon mounted on a truck, and it's spring-loaded, and it just shoots him out. And he worked 4 minutes a day. We did 2 shows every day. We had no days off, and he worked a total of 4 minutes a day. 2 minutes every show was the length of the act. He got paid really well to do this overall. I mean, it's kind of a risky job. And so one day I was wondering, how does one become the human Cannonball? Like this, what's the career path that one undertakes to become the human Cannonball? And so I asked him, and the story that he tells is fascinating. And it actually starts with the previous human Cannonball, as such stories tend to start. And he told the story, and he said, he said, this is what happened to the previous human cannonball and how I got the job. He said, so the way this works, the way this contraption works, just to give you a sense, so it's spring-loaded. It's just a big spring in there. There's no cannon fire that actually takes place. There's a little flash pod when it goes off, but he just, he slides in, they cock it back on a spring, they push the button, the ringmaster pushes the button, there's a little puff of smoke, and it just, pushes him out, and there's a net at the other end that he flies into, that he just lands on the net. He kind of does a little flip over and he lands on the net. Now the way that they know where to put the net every time, because we moved around. Every 2 days we moved to a new location, tear the whole thing down, set the whole thing back up, and we'd set up again. The way they knew where to put the net was that they had a dummy, just a mannequin kind of thing, that weighed the same as, well, the previous human cannonball. This is as he tells the story. And so we'd get to a new location, they would set up the tent, they would drive the truck, they'd stop it in the same spot in the tent every time, they would aim it, they'd put the dummy in, they'd launch the dummy, they'd see where the net where it lands, and that's where they would set up the net. Pretty simple, right? So they're making, it worked consistently, time after time. One night, they were late. This was pre-GPS, pre-nav systems, and so the way that the trucks, the caravan of trucks would know where to go is there are these little arrows that somebody would scout ahead and staple these arrows to telephone poles and that kind of thing along the way. I'm not kidding. This was the wayfinding for the circus. And they were late. It was raining, so they didn't have time to set up that evening. And so they waited until the morning to set up the human cannonball rig. And they left the dummy out overnight, and it rained. Some of you may see where this is heading. The next day, they did what they always did, right? They drove the truck into the tent, they aimed it, they put the dummy in, they shot it, saw where it landed, they put the net up. That evening, first show, in front of 4,000 children, roughly, because that's how much the tent held, the former human cannonball, the previous human cannonball, gets in a cannon, not unlike that, waves goodbye to everyone, they cock the cannon, they shoot him off, and naturally he sails way past the net. Right? He ends up well on the other side of the net. He didn't die, he was tragically hurt, but he lived through it, and he went back to Florida to recover. All circuses come from Florida, in case you didn't know that. That's kind of where it happens. And it turned out that this guy was his pool boy, the guy who cleaned his pool, and he had all this all-American look and figured it was a job upgrade from pool boy to human cannonball, and so that's how he became the human cannonball. Now, why am I telling you this story, this lengthy story about the history of the human cannonball, Clyde Beatty Circus? Is because this team made the same assumption day after day after day after day, that nothing would change and that everything would work the same way. And so they never tested their assumptions. And then the one time they didn't test it, right, tragedy happened. They assumed that everything would happen. And that's essentially what's happening in our world today. The assumptions that we're working under are constantly changing. And if we continue to work off the old assumptions and think that nothing is changing, we're going to end up with tragic consequences. Maybe we won't end up flying into the dirt in front of 4,000 children, right? But nevertheless, the success of our software and our companies and our product may change. And the reason is this. Mark Andreessen said this a couple years ago. He said, software is eating the world. Everything is becoming software. Any business of scale that wants to compete in today's economy is becoming a software business. If you think about it, right, think of the big successful businesses of today, right? Amazon, right? What business are they in? Right? Are they in the books business or are they in the movies business? No, they're in the software business. In fact, they resell their software services. Then the software of customer intelligence, logistics, e-commerce, shipping. That's how they scale their businesses. Most recently, it's drones, right? That's the business that they're in. Software is becoming the core thing, and if you're basing your assumptions on the old way of running businesses, then there will be tragic consequences ultimately for your business. And we're seeing this from a bunch of different executives in different companies. This is Venkatesh Prasad, who's one of the senior tech leaders at Ford, and he's talking about how they're not looking at cars. Right, they're not looking at cars as simply, transportation vehicles, right? They're looking at them as how do you use software to shape the experience of being in a car? And you see them experimenting with different types of things. David Zenka, who runs IT for FedEx, says, I run a software company inside of FedEx. We think of them as a delivery, as a logistics company, but in fact, there's a software company inside that's allowing them to do their work, to scale their work, and to compete in today's economy. And we've seen this happen over and over and over again, and we've seen people resist the urge to accept software as the next change in industry, right? We saw this with Napster when it came along, and this is the Recording Industry Association of America really, tried to litigate it away. This is Lars Ulrich from Metallica, who very famously fought a battle against Napster to get them to go away. There's no way this is going to be the future of music. This is going to kill it, right? And amazingly enough, today, Metallica's music is available on Spotify if you'd like to listen to it 10 years later, right? So there's an inevitability here that's happening in this industry. Netflix, again, came along, and the incumbents fought it tooth and nail, but this is never going to disrupt our business. And if you're in the United States, I challenge you to find a Blockbuster that's in business today. And even earlier today, in fact, I was reading again, it's happening with Tesla now in the US especially. So Elon Musk's electric car company, Tesla, is disrupting the automotive industry, again, through technology, through software, over-the-air upgrades, direct-to-consumer sales. You can buy a car on the internet, and the auto dealer lobby in the United States is trying to litigate them away. It's the same exact models you saw with Napster and Netflix. There's an inevitability that software is eating the world, and fighting it will only prolong the amount of time it takes you to actually join that particular revolution. And so this is our opportunity, and this is our new reality. Now look, when it comes to car manufacturing, right, this is a great way to manufacture cars today, because we know exactly what needs to go into the car, we know exactly what the end product is going to look like, and we have a pretty good guess about how that product is going to get used. And when everything is known, from the production to the sales to the consumption process, you can optimize for that through a linear process that really kind of pushes efficiency through that competition, through that process itself. You can build rigid company processes around that, and you can build cultures around optimizing that process. And what's interesting is that as software has taken over the last 20, 30 years, and more recently kind of taken over the world, what we've done is we've translated this model to the software industry, this kind of industrial assembly line model. We built silos based on disciplines, right? Somebody defines it, somebody designs it, somebody develops it, somebody tests it, somebody deploys it, and hopefully somebody actually uses it the way that we hoped that they would use it. But we don't actually know. There's too much unknown, and that it kind of broke apart the software development process. Now, the fundamental difference that's happening now with software eating the world is that software is becoming continuous. So it's been slowly evolving towards this, and now we're reaching this point where software is becoming continuous. And what I mean by that is that we can push software out to our audience very quickly in a variety of different formats. And the work that we do on our software products is never finished. We're continually iterating and optimizing and improving and pushing the software forward. There's never a finished state to the product. We're always updating, we're always learning, we're always doing more. And what's interesting is that it's this continuous, so the phrase continuous integration, I'm sure is familiar to you, but it's a continuous integration of not just systems, but it's systems, it's companies, and it's customers, and it's this continuous feedback loop that we now have access to on a regular basis if we choose to take advantage of it. And that fundamentally changes the conversation we're having with our customers, and the conversations and the infrastructure that we have inside our companies. I want to put a real fine point on what I mean by continuous. This is how often Amazon pushes code to production. Okay, this is directly from a talk that one of their DevOps guys gave at Velocity Conference. Every 11.6 seconds, somebody at Amazon pushes code to production. That's insane. It's madness, right? there's no clear sense of what the end state should be. But what they're doing is they're building this feedback loop with their audience. And because look, they're not refreshing the entire site. They're not changing the e-commerce flow. They're not redoing the navigation every 11.5 seconds. But they're running small experiments. They're taking small bites of risk. And if they're wrong, they roll it back. And if they're right, or if they think they're right, they're getting a good signal, they can expand the breadth of that experiment from, a sliver of the audience to a slightly larger piece of the audience and slightly larger. But every time they take these tiny bites of risk. And because they've got that continuous feedback loop, because they're deploying, they're seeing how people are using it, and it's coming back, they can learn very, very quickly. And there's a wealth of information that comes in that they can drive this forward. Right? And yet, most of the companies that I work with are still thinking like this: model years. Right? How many features can we pack into the next release so we can sell it for more money? Or what's the next version of the product going to do? Or how are we going to change this particular thing? And it's this is not how we work anymore. It was the way we worked for a long time. I know you guys probably did these come in the mail in the UK? Yeah. They did? Sorry. I worked on these a dozen years ago at AOL. I was responsible at least for part of this plague on the world population. But this is how we delivered software. We worked for months, 6 months at a time, towards the Gold Master release, the GM. Does that term ring a bell? Anyone? The GM release? I used to be in the music industry too. So the Gold Master is the disc from which all the other copies are made. It's the perfect one. Right? And so we worked for 6 months to make sure that that disk was flawless, or as flawless as it could be, and then we duplicate it tens of millions of times and send it across the country and across the world. And then we had a 6-month feedback loop to wait before we could learn how people were going to use it, before we could update the software, and then launch it again. So we're looking at a year before we could make any real substantial changes based on usage to the software and the way that we were delivering it. And this is how we delivered software back then. It was shrink wrapped, it was in a box, it was in the mail, it was in a store. But what's interesting is what we've learned over time is that software, there's too many unknowns in software. We don't really know the scope of the project. We don't really know what the end product is going to look like. And in a continuous world, there is no end state. And I think most importantly, we have no idea how people will use our product. We have a sense. We think that they use it this way, but how many interesting uses of software have come about simply by chance, or by people using it for a different purpose? And so we can't optimize this assembly line model. We can't optimize software development in this assembly line model. We can't ask our teams to commit to knowing everything up front and knowing what it's going to look like at the end. If we do that, we're setting them up to fail. And so as software makers, producers, leaders, managers, we have to ask ourselves a few questions. The first is this: what does this new continuous world mean for our business? How does it change the way that we actually transact as a company? How can it improve what we're doing? I think the next question we have to ask is, how can we take advantage of all this new information? Forget 11.5 seconds. Even if you're deploying once a week or once a month, even, the amount of feedback that you're pushing back into the organization is massive. The information, usage, analytics, qualitative feedback, press, whatever it is. Right? How do we take advantage of all that information? And I think most importantly is, how can we maximize the creativity and the learning and the productivity of our teams with this information? They've got to make sense of it. And so how can we give it to them in such a way that they can actually do something with it? And I think in order to survive in this new reality, we have to build this culture of innovation, this idea that we are going to take these small bites of risk, we're going to learn, and then we're going to iterate the product forward because we don't know what the end state is going to look like. And as it turns out, a culture of innovation is a culture of experimentation. You have to take these risks. You have to take swings at bat, right? If you read Jeff Bezos, all the big successful tech companies even talk about we have to maximize the amount of times we get to take a swing at a problem. Jack Welch talks about this. Eric Schmidt talks about, he calls them at-bats, right? Google Scale gives them an amazing amount of opportunities to take swings at a problem. Jeff Bezos talks about how many experiments can we run on a problem in the shortest amount of time so we can learn these things. And one of the fundamental things that comes out that has to change is this concept of deliberate strategy. I know you know what I'm talking about. Deliberate strategy is strategy that comes from the top down. It's this idea that creativity is housed in the executive suite, and that as leaders and managers, we know how to solve a problem, and we will lay it on you, essentially, and tell you, and then you will bring it to fruition. The teams will execute our vision. That's deliberate strategy. And there's a great book called The Connected Company written by Dave Gray where he really digs into this idea of deliberate strategy and how this idea of creativity at the executive suite, in the executive suite only, really holds back organizations from building this culture of innovation and experimentation. The opposite of that is emergent strategy. Strategy that comes from the bottom up. Strategy that empowers the teams to figure out how to best solve a business problem. And these strategies are based on an ongoing culture of hypothesis and a culture of experimentation. And the goal is for these to come up organically, is to give these teams a reason, a problem to solve, and then to let them figure out what strategies will actually solve those business problems. Now the trick in doing this in a large organization is you want to give your teams enough autonomy to experiment and to figure out which solutions work well. And to do so, you have to build enough slack in the system that allows them to experiment while not tanking your business while you're moving forward. And that's a delicate balance, and it's difficult to achieve. And so, but again, as I mentioned before, you're seeing this across organizations. How many experiments can you run? How many experiments can you run in the shortest amount of time? And so how do we do this? How do we set up our organization to succeed? And how do we set up our teams to take advantage of all this new information so they can build these emergent strategies? And the thing you have to start with at the core is the team. If you haven't seen Cool Runnings recently, I wholeheartedly suggest that you do. It was on during the Olympics about 1,000 times a day. And it was fabulous. It really is a good movie. It's fun. The core of innovation, the atomic unit, is the team. It's a cross-functional, collaborative team. And what I want to talk about during the middle part of this talk is what makes up an innovative team. We'll talk about three different things that make up innovative teams and how to structure them so that they stand the greatest chance of success inside your organization. The first is the anatomy of the team. Who's on the team? Who should be on one of these core innovative teams? The second is how do we task the team? How do we tell them what to do? Right? What do we tell them to go do as a team? And the third thing is how should that team work? So is there a process they should use? Is it agile? Is it lean? Is it waterfall? Is it agile fall? Is it wagile? Whatever combination of it. And I'm going to take a look at these three core elements, and we'll break it down this way. We'll do a series of anti-patterns around each one, and then we'll talk about what actually solves the problem. So let's start with the anatomy of the team. It's delicious anatomy. And let's start with some anti-patterns. How not to structure a team. The first one is this: how not to structure an innovative team. Siloed teams. Okay? Siloed teams do not have any ownership in the process. All they see is the work that's placed in front of them, that's handed to them. They're told to do their job. They apply essentially their coat of paint. Just think of it as the assembly line, and they move on. It isolates the team members from each other, and it diminishes communication. And when you diminish face-to-face communication, people rely on documentation more, and so you have to spend time writing it. You have to spend time reading it, digesting it, debating it, negotiating it, and the progress is stifled. You don't want to build teams. Siloed teams feel like service providers, right? I'll share this case study in just a second, but instead of feeling like they're a part of a particular effort to solve something, teams feel like they're a service provider. I do this one thing. I put the ones and zeros in the right order, or I put the pixels in the order that makes them pretty. But I don't actually contribute more strategically to the organization. So the team members don't feel any ownership over the product. And when that happens, they don't have a view of the whole. Every team is making a keyhole decision based on what the little bit that they know that came before them and after them, and what they need to solve. Exactly. So there's no real sense from across the product development lifecycle about who we're building a product for, what problem are we solving for them, and how do we know we're building the right stuff. And then finally, there's no collaboration in these siloed teams. They don't build on each other's ideas, the brainstorming struggles, and ultimately you're implementing somebody else's vision. Now, I mentioned to you that I've made this mistake, and that's exactly what I did. I'm a designer by trade, and 6-7 years ago, I was tasked with building a design team, a UX team at a company called The Ladders in New York. And I showed up, and the first thing that I did was we built a model that looked like this, which was essentially the in-house agency model. Essentially, I built a silo. That's the first thing I did, was build this design silo, and we started hiring into it. Now, what's happening there, everybody else was in their own silo, product management, engineering, and marketing, and they were running project requests through to the UX team. Hey, we need a designer. Hey, we need a designer. And so what would end up happening is I would be in the middle over there. There I am in the middle. I worked hard on that animation. And I was the bottleneck. People would come to me and say, we have a job. And I'd be like, oh, okay, Bob's got some bandwidth. Let's give it to Bob. Oh, we have another job. We have another project. Okay, well, Jen's got some bandwidth. Let's give it to Jen. And then they'd come back again and say, oh, Jen's got some more bandwidth. Right? And Jen's got some more bandwidth. And all of a sudden, Jen is supporting three different projects. And she's doing the best that she can to keep up with that. But whenever you start to task your teams with more than one project, for example, 3, they're coming in every day and they're choosing to piss off two people, right? Because they have to pick what their #1 priority is for the day. And that's an awkward place to put your people. Now, the other thing is that they're doing just enough work to move from one project to the next because they have other projects to deal with. So again, that sense of ownership wasn't happening there, and I was becoming a bottleneck because all the requests were coming through me. And this was essentially building a silo and a service provider type of organization. And so the question becomes, what team structure facilitates a culture of innovation? So let's look at 4 characteristics. 4 characteristics of a successful team structure. The first, that the team is small. Like this kitty. I'll quote Jeff Bezos again. And I've learned my lesson having been in London a bunch of times now. He talks about 2 pizza teams. Let's be clear, these are American pizzas. Okay? I learned this here. 2 pizza teams. If you can't feed your team with 2 pizzas, your team is too big. 2 American pizzas. It's too big. Right? So 6 people, 7 people, 8 people max, that type of thing. Now, there's a benefit to this. With 6 to 8 people on a team, you know who everybody is on the team. You know what everybody's responsible for, and the accountability is super high. There's nowhere to hide. If you're not doing your job, somebody's going to know, so you're going to do your job. Communication is tight, and the management of the team is easy because, again, it's a fairly you know exactly who's on the team, and you can ask what's going on and dig into it. So focusing on a small team is key. Right? As the team grows, it becomes more difficult to know who's on it and what's happening and who's doing what. The second is that your team is co-located and that everyone is in the same space, preferably not just in the same building or the same campus, and they're not in their department. Everybody's seated together face-to-face if possible. Now, I recognize that that's an ideal and not possible for most of us. It's not possible for me on most of my project. And so there's at least one fundamental priority that has to happen if you are not co-located and you want to build the successful, innovative teams, is you have to be awake at the same time as your colleagues. You have to be able to have conversation with them when you're awake and at work at the same time. There has to be some kind of overlap. So for example, between the East Coast of the US and London, there's overlap, and so we can collaborate, right? But I have colleagues in Singapore who are a dozen hours away from me. I don't ever get to really work with them. You know, we send emails to each other, but there's no collaboration because they're going to sleep when I'm waking up and vice versa. So small, co-located, or at least awake at the same time, dedicated. This is key. Everyone is working on this project and nothing else. No one is being siphoned off to fix bugs, to work on the CEO's pet project, on another initiative. Everyone is focused and dedicated to this initiative because if they get siphoned off, then you don't have them doing their job and you have to wait for them, and that slows the rest of the team down. And the context switching is significant. The time that it takes to switch between projects costs a lot. And the final aspect, so we've got small, co-located, dedicated, and self-sufficient. And what I mean by self-sufficient is that everything the team needs to do can be done by the people on that team. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to have a representative from every competency. There could be people who can double up, and that's fine. But everything the team needs to do, if they need to code, to design, to research, to push to production, if they need subject matter expertise, whatever it is, they can do it, and they're empowered to make those decisions. Those are the 4 qualities, right? Small, co-located, dedicated, self-sufficient of an innovative team. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is tasking the team. How do you tell the team what to do, right? And so, this is one way to do it, right? Just yell at them really loud about what to do. But that's not a good way. But we're going to start off with a set of anti-patterns, again, about how not to tell teams what to do. And the first, kind of the biggest anti-pattern that I come across, and you probably all experience this on a daily basis, is the roadmap. The product roadmap. Product roadmaps are fantastic because they tell compelling stories. You can tell a compelling story with a roadmap, right? We're here, and we're going there, and there are 5 steps in between here and there. That's a good story. A manager can take that story and give it to a VP or an executive and say, terrific, this is where we're heading. It's easy to see progress, it's easy to see delays and next steps. And what you're doing here is you're committing to fixed scope and fixed time. Right. Now, in the 15 or so years that I've been working in software, there's never been a fixed time or a fixed scope initiative where one of those things hasn't shifted. We've either shifted the scope, changed the scope, or we've moved the deadline. So essentially, we're setting everybody up to fail with this feature-based product roadmap. In the end, they end up looking like this, right? We're going to take we learned something new. The competition launched the same thing that we were working on and did a better job, so we've got to change what we're working on. Or you know what, that's not important anymore. Or we have a new CEO, and she's got a new vision, so we've got to change everything. Right? This is what it actually looks like. And I think it's fascinating. About 6 or 8 months ago, Kent Beck, one of the original Agile guys, he tweeted this. He said, product roadmaps should be lists of questions, not lists of features. And that's exactly right. Instead of saying, we know we need to build these 15 features and it's going to take 100 days to do so, we should have a list of hypotheses that talk about what we believe to be true. We believe that we should integrate Facebook authentication into our service because we think it'll increase the number of successful logins into the product, which ultimately will drive sales. And let's find out, let's experiment, and let's learn whether that's the right way to go. But when we make, because the opposite is when you make these feature-based roadmaps, what we're doing is we're incentivizing teams to create output. Right? This is the Microsoft Word version of a guitar, right? Essentially, this guitar was specifically made for Pat Metheny. He's the only person on earth who can actually play this guitar. But you know, if you're a guitar player, if you can play some chords, you could probably take advantage of this piece of it, right here. But when we build these roadmaps, we're incentivizing our teams to deliver features. And when we incentivize teams to deliver features, we end up with product bloat. A bunch of stuff that nobody uses, but it allows us to sell it as the new version. It's version 6, it's 6.2, and we can ask for more money from it. Instead of asking our teams to achieve a specific business outcome, we're just saying, hey, just keep pushing these features out because then we can sell it or market it more efficiently. And the reality is that features on their own are just not a measure of success, right? We don't know how people are going to use them. We don't know if it's going to be a good feature or a ridiculous feature, right? And so the question is, what business objective are we trying to achieve? Ultimately, what is the outcome we're trying to achieve? Now, another anti-pattern that's really tough to shake, and I don't have a great answer for this. I mean, I have an idea how to solve this, but you don't see a lot of companies doing it. Is the annual planning process? So a lot of the big companies that I work with, you know, we'll start locking down 2015 budgets and resources in about 2 or 3 months. Right? How you can possibly predict what's going to happen next year and know exactly how much money to spend on each channel or effort or initiative today, next year, is beyond me, and yet we continue to do this because this is how we determine who gets what budget every year in each department and how much we get to hire. We just can't predict the future, right? And so to share a little anecdote from my experience, again, on a situation like this, where we have kind of this lengthy planning process and this deliberate strategy approach. I used to work at this company called The Ladders, as I mentioned to you, and it was a subscription service, and the subscription numbers had flatlined. Acquisition, retention, renewals, the whole thing had flatlined. And so instead of coming to the teams and saying, teams, our numbers are flatlined, we need to improve them, what do you think? Our CEO, who was the founder of the company, did what he always did, which was he went and brainstormed somewhere, and then he had an epiphanous shower moment, and he came down to the floor where we made the software, and he said, I know what we're going to do today. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to provide every paying subscriber to our service a person in New York who will hold their hand through the job search process. Now remember, we're catering to people who make $100,000 or more. On average, the salaries were somewhere between $175 and $225. So these are fairly well-paid people in senior positions across the country. And he said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to provide them a person in a call center in New York who will handhold them through the job search process, and this will solve everything. And what we did was we spent 9 months of time. We shut everything down, 50 people, the entire consumer-facing side of the company, and essentially just took a hard left. We spent 9 months building the systems to support this initiative. Now, it might sound not that expensive, but think about it. We had to redesign the entire website, all the acquisition flows, all the pricing structures, all the billing models, all the emails. We had to install new phone systems and write all new software that would then route phone calls and emails from me to my job search assistant. We had to hire these job search assistants. We had to write scripts for them and train them and scale it up. So this was 9 months of work to push this project live, to plan what we're going to do, essentially how we're going to save the company. And 6 months after we launched it, we shut it down, the whole thing, and fired all those call center folks because it didn't work. And we had so much opportunity to test these ideas, right? Testing these fundamental assumptions. There were so many basic assumptions. Let's start with the fact that a 50-something-year-old male executive who's making $225,000 will willingly take job search advice from a 24-year-old kid in a call center in New York, right? Which is who we hired to staff the call center, right? That's a fundamental assumption that we could have tested by building nothing. We could have simply put those two people in a room to see what happened, right? And see if one will take the other's advice. We could have taken an existing cohort of subscribers and simply given them the service, just appropriated a product manager and given them the service to see what would happen. But instead, we planned this entire effort. We forced this strategy on the teams only to find out that it was a colossal failure in the end. And so instead, what we should have done, what he should have done, is come down and said, here are the outcomes that we need to achieve as a business, figure out how to solve this, and use the continuous nature of software. We were web-based. There's no reason why we couldn't push software. We were data-driven. We had A/B testing platforms. All the tools were there. There was no reason why we couldn't push these ideas to market sooner and test them to see what would actually work. And when you task your teams with these outcomes, get very granular about it. Be very specific, right? We don't want to talk about revenue or net promoter score. We want to talk about successful logins or number of second-time visitors to the site or the number of times somebody told their friend about it or viral sharing. Something that they can actually attribute their work to a specific change, because lots of things affect revenue. That's kind of an impact level metric, right? Or net promoter score. There's lots of things that could affect that. And ultimately what we're doing is we're giving teams a problem to solve, not a solution to implement. And teams will own their own solutions much more readily and be much more driven to make them better than if you've handed it to them. And they can figure out solutions to problems that could be good ideas and solutions to problems that could be bad ideas as well. Now, it's a really bad idea. I told you that when it comes to that, so how do you, this financial planning model, right? How do you, what's a potential solution to the annual planning process? Well, in the same way that you're mitigating risk with your product, you're building this small, dedicated, co-located, self-sufficient team that's trying to figure out how to solve this particular business problem, and then optimizing a product that they've found that does actually achieve that. You can mitigate your finance risk, but you have to build this infrastructure around it that then says, okay, periodically, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to fund, instead of funding this team for a year, we're going to fund them for 3 months, 8 weeks, whatever it is, and give them a success metric to hit. Your job is to increase e-commerce by 12%, or your job is to increase retention by 8%. And at the end of that initiative, of that time frame that we funded them for, this team has to come back up in front of the organization and say, you tasked us with an increasing retention by 8%. We've been working for 12 weeks, and we got it to increase by 4%. Here's what we've learned. Here's what we plan on doing next. Will you fund us for another 8 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever it is? And the organization can say, yes, terrific. The organization can say, no, that's close enough. We'll move you on to something else. Or that's no longer an imperative for the company, and save all those funds. The other thing that could happen is the team could hit its goal in a quarter or 2 quarters instead of a year. And so you've got another opportunity to save money, to mitigate the risk of spending money on a team that doesn't necessarily need to be working on a particular initiative. The team should also have the freedom to come back and say, you tasked us with moving this particular metric over 12 weeks. We've been working on it, and we don't think that this is the right thing to do. There's something else that we should be working on that's more valuable, that will move revenue or whatever it is more effectively. But it's this transparent conversation around funding and learning and initiatives that starts to do away with the annual planning process as well. But this is a really difficult shift inside organizations. The last thing I want to talk about is this. How should the team work? So we talked about who's on the team. We talked about how we task teams, right? We want to give them problems to solve and outcomes to hit. How should the team work? Agile, waterfall, lean, scrum band, can scrum, all these things, right? And once again, Antipatterns. I love these Antipatterns because they head home. This was just an excuse to use more circus photos here. These are all different people that I experienced and took photos of in the circus. This is the circus folk. I'm sorry, the elephant people. They were lovely, lovely people. These are women who walked on giant balls up ramps. That was their act. And that's Charlie. He served 3 meals a day, should you choose to eat those meals from Charlie. He was a really nice man. The point in all of this is that the circus was a very siloed organization. Right? There was actually no cross-functional collaboration across acts at all. But can you imagine what would happen if the human cannonball and the tiger trainer collaborated? Right? All of a sudden, that human cannonball act gets far more interesting if he's flying over 10 tigers, right? Right. I mean, but that's what the circus was all about. It's about doing crazy stuff like that. But there was none of that because they were so siloed and they would never share and there was no collaboration whatsoever. And the same thing holds true for your team. If you don't let them, if we don't let the teams work in a way that's cross-functional and collaborative, they'll never build on each other's ideas. They'll never feel that freedom, and they'll never be able to generate the best ideas. That's where the best ideas come from. Fixation on job titles. We love putting people in boxes, right? Your card says designer. Your card says engineer. Your product manager. You're the coach, right? And that, as if that's the only thing that these people can do. Right? The assumption is that because it says that on my card, that's the only thing that we can do. And when we think that way, we limit these people's creativity, and worse, we limit their contribution to our teams. And I love to share this story to articulate this point. Does anybody know who this is? It's not me. I showed you my long hair picture. I'm sorry? It is from Steely Dan. It is. It's not Spinal Tap. Somebody said Harry Shearer. It's not Spinal Tap. That's exactly right. This is Jeff Skunk Baxter. He is a founding member of Steely Dan, and he's a Doobie Brother. He's in the Doobie Brothers. So he's a legendary American Rock and Roll Hall of Fame guitarist. Right? Anybody know what he does today, other than play nostalgia shows and county fairs? Do you know what he does today? That's exactly right. That's fantastic. I'm glad somebody, like nobody ever knows that. He's a civilian consultant to the U.S. government on missile defense. That's what he does today. And if he showed you his CV that said Steely Dan, Doobie Brothers, you would never in a second give him any kind of time about missile defense, right? Turns out he knows a whole hell of a lot about missile defense. And the point here is that we should respect the full competencies of our team members, even though their title says engineer or designer or business analyst or whatever it is. You know, maybe they're a great designer. Maybe they're a great engineer. Maybe they know a lot about user research or marketing or whatever, right? The particular subject matter. Let people contribute in whatever way they can to the teams. They'll inevitably fall back to their core competencies when it's time to deliver software. Another anti-patterns is fear of failure. We talked about this a lot. The scope of the failure needs to be considered. If you're pushing software live every 11.5 seconds, the scope of the failure is tiny. And so you should not be reprimanded for that. In fact, it should be learning. That's all we're doing is we're learning. It's the only way to learn is to try something out and see if it works. The faster that we can learn something, the faster we learn if it works, the faster we can move forward. And again, building this culture around a fear of failure is an anti-pattern to innovation. I know I'm running a little late, so I'm going to share with you one more anecdote that I have to. I used to run the UX team at a company called Web Trends a long time ago. They were kind of the granddaddy of web analytics companies. They've been around 20 years, 25 years or so. When I worked there, they hired a new VP of engineering, and I kid you not, this man's motivational strategy for motivating the engineers was to walk up and down the aisles of the Cube farm and threaten to fire every engineer. He would just be like, "What are you doing? I'm going to fire you. Right? Hurry up, fix that, I'm going to fire you." Literally, he would do that every day. And so it was unbelievable. Like this was his management style. And all he succeeded in creating was this culture in the company where everybody did just enough not to get fired. Right? No one ever pushed the boundaries on anything. No one ever suggested anything. Everybody was just heads down at their desk, making sure they did just what they needed to do, and that's it. Right? He built this fear of failure, and no one would ever push that company forward, and that company got eclipsed by its competition over the last few years. Also, this idea of arbitrary deadlines. Often deadlines are completely made up. Right? They're just a motivational tool. There's generally no, unless it's a conference or something or a trade show, often deadlines are arbitrary and made up, and they're just made to motivate people. If there's no reason for the deadline, just give people these kind of funding cycles and let them go through that so they can achieve their business objectives. And all of this, what this does is it creates this culture where no one wants to own anything, or this CYA culture, as we call it in the States, right, where everybody's like, I'll just do my bit so I don't get fired and I can hand it off to the next person. Right? I just cover myself. I'm not going to step outside of the box. All of these anti-patterns. And so the question then is, how does a culture of innovation change the way a team works? And the thing I want to talk about is this, right? Principles that come from Lean. Two key principles that come from Lean. One is that we're always moving from doubt to certainty. We don't really know what the future is going to look like. So we're going to move from doubt to certainty. And the other is that we work in small batches. And so we take small steps from doubt towards certainty. In other words, you're making the cupcake before you make the cake. Right? That's the first thing. Allow your teams, give your teams the permission to say, we don't know the answer, we think it's this, and we're going to move in baby steps towards that, and we'll learn as we move forward. Give the teams clear definitions of success. Here's your number that you have to hit. Let us know how you're trending towards that. Make sure that we're letting everybody in the team provide whatever competency they're good at. Right? If they can do a couple of things, let them do that. If they're good at it, why not? Right? And then ultimately let them self-organize around the process. This is a long quote from the guy who invented the Post-it note. And he said when he was figuring out whether the Post-it note was a good thing or a bad thing, 3M tried to impose Six Sigma on top of that process, which optimizes production. And he's like, I don't even know if this is a good idea, if it's a bad idea, if people will like it, if people will use it. I don't know. And they tried to impose this process on top of us, and it really stifled the progress that we were making as a team. Let your teams figure out what process they should work on. You can give them some starting points if they're not clear, right? Hey, let's work in 2-week cycles. Let's do a planning meeting at the end and a retrospective, a planning meeting at the beginning and a retrospective at the end, and just a daily check-in, and then let them figure out how to best structure their working process together. And so the last thing I want to close on really quick before we take questions, and I think there's drinks being set up, which is nice, is this is hard work. It's really hard. It's culture change. It's big company, and especially in the big company, it's really hard to push this kind of culture change. The question is why? Why should we bother, right? It's risky. It can be not fun at times, right? We may lose some colleagues along the way, right? People who don't make the transition. Why should you do this? And there's 3 reasons for this. The first is that you're going to make your customers happy because you're going to build products that they actually want and can use that solve problems for them. Right? That's the first and foremost. Make your customers happy. Everything everything kind of falls from that. Second is you're going to reduce waste in your company by building products that people actually use. You're going to build successful products. You're not going to work on things that are throwaways. How many projects have we thrown away, right, over time? All of us collectively. It's probably a staggering number, right? And the last reason to do this is that you're going to increase employee morale. People are going to be happier at work. They're going to want to come to work. They're going to tell their friends. They're going to attract better talent. They're going to feel like they're a part of something. They'll be more passionate, and that hiring brand just skyrockets. And so all of this is in service of structuring these successful teams and ultimately changing your culture from a culture of delivery, right, features, to a culture of learning. How can we become a learning culture that then pushes out only the things that actually meet our customers' needs and our business needs? So that's what I got. Thank you all for coming out tonight. That was a lot of fun.